In this video, we're going to talk about how to differentiate using the first principle method. It's very easy to differentiate using the first principle. All you need to do is follow the 4 steps that are on your screen. The first thing you have to do, step 1, you add delta to the both sides of the given equation. Then the second step, which is the step 2, it says you move y to the right hand side of the equation. Then step 3, you divide both sides of the given equation by delta x. Then the final step, which is the step 4, you take the limits as delta s tends to 0. Following the steps, you see that you will get the differentiation of a function using the first principle method. Looking at this question, the first thing you have to do, look at the steps. The step 1, you add delta to the both sides of the given equation. So adding delta to the both sides, we have y plus changing y. Then on the right hand side, on the right hand side, you have x plus changing x. So the next step here is you move y to the right hand side of the equation. The next step here, you move y to the right hand side of the equation. Moving y to the right hand side of the equation, we now have changing y is equal to x plus changing x. Recall, the y is causing the equality sign, so it will change from positive y to negative y. Also recall from this equation that y is equal to x. So replacing this y with its value, which is equal to x, we now have changing y is equal to x plus changing x. Replacing y, we know that y is equal to x, which is minus s. So looking at this equation, you could see that this 2x, the 2x here can actually cancel out. That is x minus x. So cancelling the both s, we now have changing y is equal to changing x. So we now move to step 3, which is divide both sides by changing x. Dividing both sides by changing x, we now have changing y all over changing x is equal to changing x all over changing x. Then this in turn, you see changing x will cancel changing x, so we now have changing y all over changing x is equal to 1. You see from here, this changing x and this one are the same. Look at the cursor. The two changing s will cancel out. Changing s divided by changing s. That's how we arrived at 1. So the next step now, we take the limits as delta s tends to 0. So the last and final step says we should take the limit as delta s tends to 0. One thing I want you to note is that whenever you take the limit of a function, this change in y all over change in x will automatically be converted to dy all over dx. So taking the limits in this case, you see that this change in y over change in x will now be converted to dy all over dx is equal to 1. So this is the final answer. So let's move to the second example. Using the first principle, find the derivative of y is equal to 2x. If you find this video helpful, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell and set it to all, so you get notifications whenever I upload new videos. Thank you. Also, if you find this video helpful, hit the like button as it will help other users find this video on YouTube. Thank you once more. In the second example, we were told to find the derivative of 2x using the first principle. So let's write the equation y is equal to 2x. So the first step, what we have to do, we add delta x to the both sides of the equation. So adding delta x to the both sides of the equation, we now have y plus change in y is equal to, you are adding the delta x to the x and the y variable. On the right hand side, we now have, recall we are adding the delta x to the x variable, the x and the y variable. So we are going to write it in this form: 2 open bracket. There's a bracket here because we are adding the delta x to the x variable and not the 2. So we have to write it in this form, that is x plus delta x. Now close your bracket. So the next thing you have to do, you have to open the bracket. So we now have y plus change in y is equal to, right now you open the bracket, 2 multiplied by x, you have 2x plus 2 multiplied by delta x, you have 2 delta x. So the next step now, we have to move the y to the right hand side of the equation. Moving the y to the right hand side of the equation, we now have change in y is equal to 2x plus 2 change in x. Recall the y is crossing a negative sign, so we're going to have minus y. So I would also like you to recall that from the equation, y is the same as, y can be represented as 2x. The y here can be represented as 2x. Therefore, replacing y with 2x, we now have change in y is equal to 2x plus 2 changing x minus y. We all know that y can be represented with 2x because from the given question y is equal to 2x. So we're going to replace this y with 2x. So not neglecting this negative sign, you now have minus 2x. So looking at this last equation, we can see that this 2x can cancel out. So we now have 2x minus 2x, which is equal to 0, which is 2x minus 2x is equal to 0. So we now have changing y is equal to, by the time this subtract this, so we'll be left with this. So we now have 2 changing x. So the next step now is to divide both sides by delta x. So dividing both sides by delta x, we now have this changing y all over changing x is equal to 2 changing x all over dividing both sides by delta x. So you now have this. Looking at this, we could see that you can see that delta x can cancel out. So cancelling the delta s on the right hand side, we now have changing y over changing x is equal to 2. That is when these two delta s cancel out, you now end up having 2. So the next step is to take the limits as delta x tends to 0. So taking the limits, recall I explained that by the time you take the limits, this symbol you see changing y over changing x will be converted to dy over dx. Having said that, taking the limits as delta s tends to 0, we now have dy over dx is equal to 2. So this is your final answer. Are you a student looking for the right place to learn and connect with friends with similar mindsets? Or are you good at maths, looking for a platform to earn money with your knowledge? Or are you looking for a platform where you can drop any question and get it solved in minutes? Visit our website www.vinstech.com and sign up for our premium services and start learning and earning. Check the link to our website below in the description of this video, and I promise you won't regret it. Let's now solve the third example, which says using the first principle, find the derivative of y is equal to 10x. Let's first write down the question, which says y is equal to 10x. So following the steps that I've mentioned earlier, you add delta s to the both sides of the equation. Adding delta s to the left hand side, we now have y plus changing y is equal to, then adding delta to the right hand side, we now have, there's a bracket because we are adding the delta x to the s variable and not the 10, so we have to separate it. That's why we have a bracket here, as I mentioned earlier. So adding the delta s, we now have x plus changing delta x, and now close the bracket. Then the next thing to do is to open the brackets. Opening the brackets, we now have y plus change in y is equal to, you have 10 multiplied by x, we have 10x, then 10 multiplied by delta x, you now have 10 delta x. So the next step now, we now move y to the right hand side. Moving y to the right hand side, we now have change in y is equal to 10x plus 10 change in x. Moving y to the right hand side, the next thing we have to do, we have to move y to the right hand side. Moving y to the right hand side, we now have change in y is equal to 10x plus 10 change in x. Recall the y will cross the equality sign, which is change it from positive y to minus y. So also recall that the value of y is equal to, look at the cursor, is equal to 10x. So we have to replace this y with 10x. Replacing the y with 10x, we now have change in y is equal to 10x plus 10 change in x minus, the value of y is 10x, so we now replace y with 10x. Looking at this, you realize that the 10x can actually cancel out 10x minus 10x. So cancelling the 10x, they both 10x, we now have change in y is equal to, the both 10x minus 10x, which is equal to 0, cancel out, so we now have 10 change in x. So the next thing to do now is we divide both sides by delta x. That is the step 4. We divide both sides by delta x. Dividing both sides by delta x, we now have change in y all over change in x is equal to 10 change in x all over change in x. You could see that the two change in x can cancel out, so we now have change in y all over change in x is equal to, by the time the two delta x cancel out, we now have 10. Then the final step, we take the limits as delta x tends to 0. So taking the limits, the change in x, change in y over change in x will now change to dy dx. Taking the limits, we now have dy dx is equal to 10. So this is your final answer. If you find this video helpful, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell and set it to all, so you get notifications whenever I upload new videos. Thank you. Also, if you find this video helpful, hit the like button, as it will help other users find this video on YouTube. Thank you once more.